Boker Tov, Shavua Tov. Today's daf is daf Mem Zayin in Gitin for a fortunate for Loza ben Ruma and Yosef Israel B'Chai Michal, and for Ilu Neshama of
Hanuch ben Yosef.
Hanuch ben Yosef. Today Yud Gimel Tammuz is his York side. Okay, so we're at about in the 8-9 lines down on the page of Mem Zayin Ra'alah. Rish Lakish, was a highwayman, a bandit, and later on, Rabbi Yochanan was makar of him and gave him a sister in marriage. But when he was young and he was still a bandit, he was a tough guy. So Rish Lakish, he sold himself over to the L'doi. L'doi were cannibals. He had him at the end of yesterday's daf. Shakal Ba'adei, why did he sell himself to cannibals? Because he wanted to beat them up. He wanted to kill them. He wanted to get rid of that sect, that group of people eating guys, and he wanted to. So he made it. He sold himself over to them. And Shakal Badei Chaisa, because he took with himself a weapon. What did he take? He took a Chaisa, a little bag or a vial of some sort, a little bottle with Olgasan, and like a rock inside, a heavy metal or stone item. And he was going to use that. Looked like these Arabs. You ever see the Arabs coming in the morning? They always have a little bag from the makola, a little plastic bag with their food. That's how you could tell. They're always the same. So he had a little bag with him. It looked like he had his lunch, but it was really a weapon. Amar Gamira, he said, I guess, Gamira Diyomi Abbas, they all know that, everybody knows that the cannibals are eventually going to eat the guy. They're going to kill him. So they know that, in the last day they're going to kill you. Call the boy Minayu Abdile. Whatever you want, they can do. It's like we have this tradition is a long tradition. And on capital, when people are killed on death row, the last day they give them whatever meal they want, steak and French fries, whatever. They get whatever they want. So called the B'Menavle. So that you should rationalize that they should be mochel. That when you give him whatever he wants, so it should be so he should mochel for the blood that you're going for the blood that they're going to take his blood. They're going to kill him. So mochel for that. Another pshat he brings out from the Aruch here is that if he goes out in a good mood because he just got his last wish, his blood will be a little sweeter. When they taste it, it's like, making the food better. Anyway, Yuma Basra, the last day when they were going to kill him, Amalei said, what's your wish? What would you like? You get your last wish. Amalei told him, Be'ina amtechinu, I'd like to tie you all up. I want all these guys to be tied up. And sit down. Okay, and I want you to be tied up and sit down. Every one of you, palga. I'd like to give you 1.5 blows of my bag over here. I got this bag, and I like to hit each one of you 1.5 times. That's what I like to do. Okay, that's his last wish. You have to grant his last wish. Continue. So he tied them all up, when he sat them down. Each one of them, as soon as he gave him one blow, the guy was, he passed out. As soon as he gave him one blow, he knocked them out like they were unconscious. One of them, or the last one, whatever, one of them, or maybe the first one, it's not clear. One of them grimaced, he was so hurt that he looked like he was smiling. He grimaced. You're laughing at me. Rish Lakish said to him, I still have half a blow coming to you because you all agreed to get 1.5 blows, right? One hard one and then a little one, right? So you're laughing at me? I said, Katlinu killers. He killed them all that way. He knocked them all out and he killed them. So that was his last wish. His last wish was to enable him to kill them all. Nafik, he went out to Asa, came. Yosef, he sat, he ate and drank all day, whatever he wanted. This is again in his early days before he became a Choser B'Tshuva. So he sat and he ate and drank all day. Amalei Barse, his daughter said to him, Lo boss midei lemezgalai. You're so big, you don't want something to rest on, to sit on. Amalu biti krisi kari, my big belly, that's my pillow. That's all I need. I lay down on my stomach, and that's good enough for me. When he died, when he died, it was of course later on after he had done tshuva. And there was a story of Rabbi Yochanan Rish Lakish had left something over as Yerusha. Rish Lakish said, "Oh, you're a fool, you leave over a pot of lentils or a little bit of saffron over here." The Gemara says, whatever you leave over. In other words, we all know that the fights in families usually break out when the father dies and the mother dies, and the Yerusha has to be split up, and people start making claims. I took care of him, you took care of him, it was my money, the business, I did the business, you did the business, but that's The ones where there's no money, there's no fights, right? When they leave over the money. The problem is, of course, timing your death with the end of the money, right? Either the money runs out too early or runs out too late. So that's the idea. So he left over a measure of saffron. That's all he left over. And he called about himself. They left their wealth to others. In other words, like, it's better not to leave anything over to consume it all in your lifetime. That was a little story with Rish Lakish, his earlier life and his later life after he became a chos b'tshuva. Says the Mishnah. Now, in Eretz Yisrael, we know the land has kedusha. Okay, there's a machlokas, certainly Yerushalayim and the base Midrash is Kitchelas Lavo, and the rest of Eretz Yisrael possibly not. That the rest of Eretz Yisrael wasn't kedusha, but that's a machlokas. Certainly, Eretz Yisrael has a kedusha. May not have the same kedusha it had originally, but it has a kedusha. So, what about giving bikurim? So, let's say you sell your field in Eretz Yisrael to goyim. People need money; they sell their field. So the Girsan on Mishnah is lokeach, or maybe men of bikurim. You still have to buy back from the bikurim. Bikurim is a chiyuv on the field, right? Owns the field, and as we'll see, there's a shaila is: do you have to? Does the field still retain its kedusha even after it was sold? So the Mishnah says you have to buy back bikurim. They tikkun olam, because of tikkun olam. What does tikkun olam mean? Many times tikkun olam means simply, we call it the benefit of society. Just that things should be better. What do we mean over here? So here Rashi tells me tikkun olam is you shouldn't be accustomed to selling fields to goyim. We don't want them to have a hold on part of Eretz Yisrael. So we want to discourage selling your land. Sometimes people have to sell; they're desperate, but we want to discourage them from selling land in Eretz Yisrael. And also, if they do have to sell, at least they should try to buy it back, to ransom it back. So because of that, the tikkun olam over. So he said over here, so it sounds like it's a drabanan. That's what it sounds like. The Gemara is going to correct this, but it sounds like if you have to sell your field to a guy in Eretz Yisrael, the rabbi said, you know what? You should buy back the amount of produce, the bikurim you give from the Sheva Minim. You should buy it back from them to bring it to the base of Mikdash, to bring the bikurim. In other words, you're going to have to buy that back with no gain to you other than doing the mitzvah. As we'll see later on, bikurim is a mitzvah on the land that you have to take the first fruits of the land have to be brought to the base of Mikdash, and it's not a question of trumas and meiser. Example, meiser you only have to give. The Gemara is going to say later on if you want to eat the food. Let's say you have a big field and you don't harvest it. You have to give meiser only if you're going to eat it. If you're not going to eat it, you can just leave it. You don't have to give trumas and meisers if you're not going to eat it. But bikurim you have to give anyway. So here he says, look, if now there's another girsa that says, if you look in the Mishnah, it says is if you buy a field from a guy, this look on the side, and Yisrael buys it back from him, even though the guy owned it, but there's a chiyuv on the buyer to give it. The idea is the same, that Eretz Yisrael apparently retains its kedusha. That's what it sounds like. But he says when tikkun olam sounds like it's only because of tikkun olam, not really because it retains its kedusha and have to give the equipment, rather so that you shouldn't, like Rashi says, what's the tikkun olam? That you shouldn't sell your fields to goyim, and if you do, you're desperate and you have to sell it. You try to buy it back to get the bad lands back from the goyim, like people are doing here, buying lands back from the Arabs in the old city, wherever near the old city, around Yerushalayim, etc. Amarabba. So that's what the Mishnah said. So here in today's daf, we're going to have two famous machlokas. The first machlokas is, does a guy acquisition of land in Eretz Yisrael, is that acquisition exempt trumas and meisus? Does it exempt trumas and meisus? So now it doesn't mean that there's no kedusha at all. The Chazon Ish and others talk about that it's for example, that things that are arla and things like that still apply, and it does have kedusha. But in terms of trumas and meisus, does it apply? So Rabbah gives you the first one. Rabbah holds even if a guy buys the land, it still has kedusha. So let's say a guy bought land. It was fallow when he bought it, and he fertilized it, and he seeded it, and he grew some produce, and he's got a big bumper crop over here, and he sells that crop to the Jew. So he says, wait a minute. He sold, it was the guy's produce, right? It was the guy's produce. Is there a chiv and meiser or not? He says there is. Ain can you come back to give him? I said, still chiv meiser. Of course, the guy doesn't have a chiv himself to give meiser. But if you buy that produce, you have to give meiser because the kedusha is retained. Ain can you come? The guy's acquisition does not exempt it from meiser shenemer. Based on the pasuk Kiliya Oretz, Hashem says the land is always mine. Eretz Yisrael is ha'aretz. It's always mine. What does that mean? Likush starts. The kedusha is retained. If a guy buys land in Eretz Yisrael, he's allowed to do whatever he could build up on the land. He could dig pits and ditches and caves. He could do whatever he wants. That you're allowed to do. But the Chiyav Ma'is remains Shenemar. How do we know he's allowed to do it? Hashemayim Shemaim Lashem V'Aretz V'San L'Bnei Adam. Shemaim is God's. And the land was given to Bnei Adam. Even Goyim, they could do that in land. That's Rabba's opinion. That the Kedusha, as far as Meiser goes, is retained. Again, it's only if you want to eat it. But the question is, if a Jew buys a guy's produce in Eretz Yisrael that the guy produced on his land, Yichav Meiser, point Rabbi Yoar. Rabbi Lezer, no. He says, no. The guy does have ownership in the land so that his Meiser is exempted, that you don't have to, if you bought the produce from a guy, you don't have to give too much Meisers. Shenemar, to Gancha, your grain, not the grain that was grown by Goy. Is the opposite. He says, Meiser Yechayev, but he doesn't have the right to dig it up and dig pits and ditches and caves and things like Shemar. Lashem Aretz. Hashem owns Eretz Yisrael. He doesn't want the Goyim to mess around with it. Pretty strange thing that he can't even dig there. Okay. Micah Miflagi. What's the machlokas here between Rabbah and Rabbi Lezer? Rabbi Lezer holds Marsav. Rabbi Lezer, very simple. Your grain is chayav in Trumas Maisis, not the grain of Goyim. Umar Savar, but the Tanakama, that would be Rabbah, would say, Umar Savar, Diguncha v'lo diguncha. Diguncha means the grain that you store, meaning the final product, after winnowing, etc. After that, only yours is chayav v'lo diguncha v'chavim, and not what's produced, not if it's produced. But if a Jew bought produce, bought wheat, barley, whatever, from a goy who grew it in Eretz Yisrael, and then he processed it, then the Jew processed it, then the Jew would be chayav. So according to Rabbi Lezer, you would be potter, right? Be potter in you would be. I'm sorry. According to Rabbi Lezer holds that if a guy grew it, you're a potter. Period. Whereas the Tanakama Rabbah says no. In other words, it goes by who final produced the land. The fact that the guy owned it does not exempt it from Trumas HaMaisros. All that counts is who processed it, who processed the food. Even if the guy owned it, but you bought it from him and you processed it, you're chayav in Trumas HaMaisros. According to Rabbi Lezer, no. If a guy grew it, it's potter from Trumas HaMaisros. So you have this machlokas. Amar Rabbah. So it's a famous machlokas. Yesh kinyan lavkachavim lafkia midei meiser or ein kinyan lavkachavim Eretz Yisrael to exempt from meiser. So Rabbah says ein kinyan lavkachavim Eretz Yisrael lafkia meiser. The Lord says yesh kinyan lavkachavim lafkia Eretz Yisrael lafkia midei meiser. That's machlokas here. Amar Rabbah. So Rabbah says, what's my proof that a guy's ownership does not exempt the land from chiyuv of meiser? Leket shekampeh. Leket shekampeh we know is free for the poor, right? That's like shekampeh from your field. Let's say shalom kachavim. If it belonged to a guy, you're chayav meiser. What do you mean chayav meiser? What are we talking about? The guy doesn't give meiser. It says elim kain hifka unless the guy was mafkir. What's the case here? Elim in Israel. If the land belonged to the leket shekampeh was from a Jewish owned property, and a guy gathered it. Says Elim Kain Hifker. What do you mean? It's not it's chayav and meiser unless you're a mafkir. A mifker v'kaimi. If it's a Jew's land and he left leket shekampeh in the field, it's already mufker. What do you mean? It's chayav and meiser unless he was mafkir. If it was a Jewish land, it was already hefker. Elabdicha must be that it belonged to a guy, but like Tina Yisrael and a Jew gathered it, a Jewish poor person. So a guy is not chayav basically in leket shekampeh. But if he left like a shekampeh, then a Jew gathered it, right? The Jew's chayav meiser. Time why? Because it belonged to a goy. Time the hifker because he was mafkir. Hello hifker. But if he wasn't mafkir, it'd be chayav meiser. What do you mean? If a goy owned the land and he left food for the poor over there. He says the poor person, the poor Jew who gathered it, has to give meiser unless the guy was mafkir. Hefker is potter for meiser. We learn on Psukim hefker is potter for meiser. But if he wasn't mafkir, you have to give meiser. What do you mean give meiser? It was owned by a guy. It was a Goyish land. That shows you that even a guy owns the land, but if a Jew got the produce from that land, you're chayiv a meiser. That's a proof to Rabbah that ain't kinyan of chavim be'etzrol of meiser. A guy's ownership is not exempted from meiser, as you see over here. If this Jew picked up free food that the guy left him, and the guy was not mafker, he wasn't mafker, but he allowed the Jew to gather some. He didn't make it hefker. Chayiv and meiser. Why? Because a guy's ownership is not exempted from meiser. It's a proof to Rabbah. Really was a Jew's, but like kind of kachavim. And a guy gathered. It was a Jew's land. It wasn't a guy's land. No, he didn't mafker adai to Yisrael. It's only mufker for Jews. Adai to kachavim. It's not mufker for goyim. That's what we're saying over here. That it really is Jewish owned, like it should compare, which is hefker for like mafker for Jews and not mafker for goyim. It's not totally hefker, and therefore we say if a guy gathered it and then you bought it from him, it'd still be chayiv and meiser because it wasn't mufker for the guy, and therefore the reason you're chayiv is because it was Jewish. It wasn't. Oh my God! Our question is if a guy owns land in Eretz and grows produce there, is it chayiv and meiser or not? So that's what Rabbah said. Rabbah tried to bring proof from there, but we said no. Could be speaking more where the land was owned by Jews. The guy took it, and the guy gathered it up, and it wasn't mufker for him. So if he sold it now to another Jew, a Jew would have to give meiser unless you were mafker for everybody, and he wasn't mafker. So the answer is he was only mafker for the Jews. It wasn't mafker for everybody. If the Jew was mafker for everybody, then it would be potter for meiser. Tashma, now we're going to try to bring a proof against Rabbah. Rabbah said that ain't kinyan like kachavim lafkim day meiser. Tashma Yisrael shalakach sadam efkam. A Jew bought a field from a guy. Actually, before it grew a third. Notice the chiv of meiser is only when it grew a third. Okay, so a Jew bought a field from a guy before it grew a third. Then he sold it. Yisrael bought it from a guy before it grew a third, and then then he sold it back to him after it grew a third. Now he threw it back to him after it grew a third. Now if he grew it back, right? Throw it back to the guy after it grew a third. Now, so we say over here, Yisrael again, Yisrael shalakach sadav epkachav actually beishlish, v'chazar machalo mishivish, and he sold it back to the guy after it grew a third. Chayavas v'meiser, it's chayiv v'meiser. Why is it chayiv v'meiser? Because it grew a third in the rishus of the Jew. In other words, obviously the guy's not going to give meiser, but the Jew has to give meiser. The Jew or whoever has the produce, either the Jew sold it to him or the other Jew buys it from the guy subsequently. It's chayiv meiser because really that's true. Shekvan is chayiv meiser. It's just chayiv in meiser when the Jew bought it. This chayiv only if what it was chayiv because it grew a third in the rishus of the Jew. Lo is chayiv lo. But if it didn't go a third in the rishus of the Jew, if it grew a third when in the rishus of the guy. In other words, if the Jew had not bought it from the guy before it grew a third and then grew a third in the rishus of the Jew, had it grown a third in the rishus of the guy, it's mashma that he wouldn't be chayiv in meiser. What do you mean? According to Rabbah, the guy's ownership is not exempted from meiser. It's mashma that a guy's ownership does exempt it from meiser. Says the Gemara, Ma'askin Basuria. Doesn't say anything here about Eretz Yisrael here. This was in this acquisition, the sale and the sale back took place in Syria. David HaMelech went out on his own. He went out on his own. It was a personal conquest, not a general conquest authorized, but for all the Jews. Therefore, Syria is not considered Eretz Yisrael. That's why if the produce grew a third in Syria in the hands of a guy, it would be potter from meiser. It was chayiv and meiser midrabanan. If it grew a third in Jewish owned hand, you have to give meiser. If it grew a third in Goyish hands, you're not chayiv meiser. But if it grew a third in Eretz Yisrael, if it wasn't in Syria, Rabbah would maintain that you're still chayiv and meiser. Obviously, the guy's not going to give meiser, but if you buy the produce from him, you have to give meiser. Tashma, another proof against Rabbah. Yisrael b'Chav, this is the Mishnah we just had in the Goim also. Tashma Yisrael b'Chav, he says on the side, it's in Chulin and Erevin, I just had it in the Mishnah in the Goim. Tashma Yisrael b'Chav shalaku sada b'shutas. Let's say, we're assuming now that it's an Eretz Yisrael. A Jew and a guy went into a partnership. They bought a field together, right? Bought a field together. Now, what about the produce? A guy's produce apparently is not chayiv in Meiser. That's what we're saying now. A Jew's is. So what about the produce? When the produce grows in Eretz Yisrael, each kernel of grain that grows, according to Rebbe, each kernel is partly tevel, the part that's owned by a Jew, and partly chulin, the part that's owned by a guy, right? Therefore, Rebbe says, therefore, what do you do with this? If the produce, right, even when they split it up, every grain is part and part. So what the Jew has to do is give tumas or meisus mineu bay from that same stuff, from that same bag of produce, so that he's giving tumas or meisus from tevel, from his own tevel on tevel. You can't do it. You can't give tumas meisus from here on something else or on something else on it, because if you give it from something else on it, you're giving from chiyav al meiser, from real tevel on this which is part and part. Or if you give tevel from the tevel, if you give from this to meisers on something else, you give them an aptur chiyav, because every grain is partially tevel, partially chulin. You can't give tumas or meiser. Yeah.
Said that if a person has tevel over here,
right,
and he has tevel over here,
right,
that he can take.
That's right.
Tevel over here.
That's right.
That tevel over
That's
there.
right. But over here, because over here, right, because
there,
yeah,
and he has his
not the guy, he has a tevel
so
chulin.
you can take from over there.
Right, no, but he can't, because each grain over here, like eventually every grain has partially tevel, partially chulin, because it's partnership. Let's split it up now. Let's say they split it up. When they split it up, as we'll see, Rebbe doesn't hold the brera, so he holds each grain is still partially tevel, partially chulin. So if you take grain from here, from this partial, we'll call it the mixture, and give it on regular tevel, part of this is already pater. Part of this is already pater because it's chulin. So you can't give pater on chulin, and you can't give from chiyav on this. Doesn't work. You have to give from chiyav on chiyav. You can't.
Both of them have chiyuv.
Not both of them. I have other grain that I bought it together with the guy. I'm the good Jew, and I split it with my partner, the guy. And I have this mixture over here, and I have other stuff that's chayiv and meiser. If I give from this on that, no good. Why? Because and if I give from that on this, it's no good. We're not talking about the guys. The guys doesn't care. The guy doesn't care about it.
That's understood.
Okay.
The guy has a mixture of chulin and tevel. And
we don't care about the guys. The guys is not important. We're not looking at the guys. We're talking about if the Jew gets it from a guy, or the Jew splits it with the guy. I'm the partner, or the guy sells his whole mixture to some other Jew. What that Jew has to do is give trumas and meisus from the mixture on the mixture. Can't give it from this mixture on tevel or tevel on this, because then that wouldn't work. Now, that's Rabbi's opinion. Shimon Gamliel says no. Right? What he says like this. I'll tell you what we do. What happens? There's a mixture, right? Rebbe says every grain is partially tevel, partially chulin. The Rabbanan say no, it's a mixture now. The whole thing is mixed up together. But after they split it up, the Jews is chayiv is tevel, and the guys is chulin. In other words, you say brera, igloi milsim afreya, that the part that was going to be given to the Jew is tevel, and the part that was going to go to the guy he doesn't have a chayiv. He's not chayiv in tevel. Ad kan lo pli ela the marsav yesh brera, marsav rein brera. Machlokes is only what that Rav Shapiro says brera. In other words, when it's split up, it's determined. It's like you say that retroactively it was determined that what the Jew was going to get is chayiv and tevel. Is tevel, and what the guy's going to get is not tevel because he's a guy. So that's what Rav Shapiro says, and the Rebbe says no, we don't hold a brera. When they owned it together, every grain was a mixture. You can't change that, and therefore every grain is still a mixture. Umar Savrain Brera. That's machlokas. Why don't you say that the guys, everybody holds that a guy's ownership in Eretz Yisrael takes away from Meiser, because you say tevel v'chulin. What do you mean tevel v'chulin? Why just because a guy owns it isn't chulin? It's still chayiv and tevel. It's still chayiv and Meiser. It's still tevel. Elamai, you see over here that everybody holds at what? and that you see it from here that whether it's Rebbe or Shimon Gamliel, a guy's ownership in Eretz Yisrael takes away from the chiyuv of meiser. Otherwise, it wouldn't be called chulin. That's why it's called chulin, the part that belongs to a guy. If a guy's ownership would take away would not take away the chiyuv of meiser, then it's all tevel. What's the problem over here? Achanami Yisuri again. This case is not in Eretz Yisrael. That's what Rabbah will say. Rabbah will say that in Eretz Yisrael, a guy's ownership does not take away from the chiyuv of meiser. This is speaking about in Surya, except for kibush yachid shmei kibush. So again, this is his answer. But again, Rabbah maintains his ground based on the psukim that a guy's ownership does not take away from the chiyuv of meiser, and Rabbi Elazar says that it does take away. Tashma. What about our Mishnah? Our Mishnah says if you sell your field to a guy, and I'm talking about in Eretz Yisrael, maybe Bikurim, you only have Bikurim in Eretz Yisrael. Here we're talking about Eretz Yisrael. It says if you sell your field to a guy, you must buy from him back the Bikurim and give it. Tikkun Olam. What's the Tikkun Olam? What do we say in the Mishnah? Michael, it was just when you walked in, we said that Rashi in the Mishnah. What's the Tikkun Olam? In other words, so that you shouldn't be accustomed to selling your fields to Goyim and Eretz Yisrael. And if you do, you'll at least make an attempt to buy it back, to ransom it. So what do you say? Make Tikkun Olam. It's only Rabbanan. If you sell your field to a guy in Eretz Yisrael, you should buy back the Bikurim, buy back the pros from to give Bikurim, so that they encourage you to keep it. Make Tikkun Olam, Midaraisa love, and not Midaraisa, make it's mashma that the field doesn't really, not really chayev. If the guy bought the land, it's not chayev in Bikurim, Meiser, etc. Amar Rashi, and Rashi explains over here, you're chayev to buy it back. You're chayev to look at Rashi explains because what does that mean? Because Midaraisa, you're putter. Now, what does that mean? The fact that you have to buy back the Bikurim is either a Draban or a Daraisa. It doesn't say you have to buy it back to give Meiser, because I said before, Meiser you only chayiv if you want to eat it. If you want to sell, if you want to take it, you want to give it to somebody else. You want to sell it to somebody else. If you want to sell it or eat it, then you're chayiv Meiser. But if you just leave it in the hands of the guy, you're not chayiv in it. But Bikurim is a chayiv to give it if the land has kedusha to it, and there's no and owning it by a guy does not take away its kedusha, so you would have to bring the bikurim anyway. And here he says, why do you bring the bikurim? It's only because they're rabbanon. It's only they tikkun olam. They tikkun olam. It's not chayiv midaraisa. I mean, it's mashma that it loses its kedusha. Again, a kasha on Rabbah. Ravashi shtei on a I'll tell you what. No, it's really deraisa. It's not that it's a chiyuv rabbanon because the guy owns the land and therefore there's no chiyuv. A Goyish ownership does not take away the chiyuv of meiser, does not take the chiyuv of, if you want to eat it, does not take away the chiyuv of bikurim in any case. So there's a bikurim you have to give whether you're going to eat it or not. But it's really doraisa. So what's something they take it all? They take it but they would do it. Mikara have a meiser meraisa. Originally, when they sold the field to a guy, they would buy it back. They would buy the bikurim part back to give it to bikurim meraisa. Keeping the chazal to come make grievous avnes. Once they saw that the rabbi saw that the Jews would since they would buy the bikurim back, they saw that on occasion when they needed money, they would sell it to the guy. The subject is Shasai Kaimet. Not a big deal to sell the field to a guy. It stays Kedusha anyway. Just he has the ownership now. He has the Tofas Arba, he has the document and all that, but it stays the Kedusha. I still buy back the bikurim, not so bad. Takinu, the low laces. So they saw that people were accustomed to sell their fields to guy because it stays as the Kedusha. They didn't want the rabbis didn't want the Jews to do that. So they said, you know what? Don't bring bikurim. If you sell to guy, don't bring bikurim. I'm going to rise, so you have to bring bikurim. Okay, sheval tasei. They said, don't bring bikurim, so people will feel that by selling it to a guy, that's it. It loses its kedusha. Even the chazal, once the rabbi saw afterwards the mandalo sagila, the one who didn't have enough money, meaning the one who was forced to sell, who would sell anyway to guy because they needed money. Mizvan. Now they would sell it and they wouldn't even bring bikurim, and it would just say stay permanently in the hands of the goyim. How did Takino? They were talking again the license they should bring bikurim to encourage them to let them know it still has kedusha. You should buy it back. That was the point. So it was a double takana. It was really a daraisa. Then they said don't bring bikurim because this way you'll don't bring bikurim. So you should be discouraged from selling to the guy. Right, so you should think that the kedusha is gone, but people said they sold anyway. They sold it anyway. They sold it anyway to the goyim because they needed money and they weren't bringing bikurim. So Rabbi said, "No, doc, go back, bring bikurim. We're going back to the original daraisa. Bring bikurim." So you should realize that it's still a kedusha, and perhaps you'll be encouraged at least to buy the field back. All right, so we have this machlokus between Rabbah and Rabbi Lazar whether yesh kinyan levichavam be'eretz Yisrael afkiv midei meiser or not. Rabbah says, and apparently that's the halacha. Ein kinyan levichavam be'eretz Yisrael afkiv midei meiser. Even if a guy had land in Eretz Yisrael and he grew produce and you bought it from him, you bought the produce, you're chayiv in meiser. If not, now we have another famous machlokus that we have throughout Shas, but Bakama elsewhere. But Matzia. Let's say you sell your field for pears. You sell field like this. I'm selling you. It's like a leasehold. You know what? I'm giving you a 5 or a 10-year lease that you can work the land and keep the fruits. After 5 or 10 years, I get the field back. Right? I get the field back. Now we're speaking about at a time when there was no Yovel, because if there was Yovel, it's coming back anyway. Yovel means it goes back anyway. In Yovel, every sale is a temporary sale. Just you get to use the land till the Yovel, and that's it. But let's say at a time when there was no Yovel, like now, when there's no real Yovel, and you sell your field for 5 or 10 years. Question is, does the purchaser, is he considered like he owns the land so that he's made Bikurim? When he brings Bikurim, he reads the Psukim, because the Pasuk says, when you're supposed to read from your land. So Machshel Pesach Belchman says maybe when you bring the Bikurim, you also read the Psukim. You have to read the Psukim. Why? Because the land is considered yours, right? So the question is, right, like Rashi says, it's speaking of so it's like Kinyan Aguf. So you have to read the Psukim. It says, do you own the land? Is it yours? Rabbi Yochanan says, yes, like you own the land. Maybe you read the Psukim because if you have a lease on the land for 5 or 10 years, for the payros, it's like you own the land. And you read the Psukim, maybe ain't a Kori. So there's famous machlokas Rachas. Rabbi Yochanan maybe Kori because he owns Kinyan Payros, Kinyan Guftami. Owning the payros is like you own the land itself. Maybe ain't a Kori. It's not like you own it, and therefore you have to bring the Bikurim, but you don't read the Psukim. So Rabbi Yochanan who holds what? Maybe because Kinyan Paris is Kinyan Guf. Yes, Bishlokish it says Uleveisecha, right? It says V'samachta v'chalta v'limkum se v'samachta v'chalta Uleveisecha. Beisecha is your wife. Maybe Bikuri Ishto. His wife brought land into the property, into the marriage. He has to bring Bikurim from that land too, even though it's not his. What does a man have on his wife's property? He has the right to eat the payros during their marriage, right? That's the same thing. It's not his land; it's hers. So if we are maybe Bikuri Ishto B'Koreh, and he reads it because the pasuk of Hashem Satli goes on that too on his wife's property. That shows you Kinyan Paris is Kinyan Guftam because that doesn't really own the land; he only has Paris Amalei. So it's like says that's shiny Hassam. That's different by the wife. The civil of Beisecha. There we have a special pasuk. Ula Beisecha. Your wife's property is included. It's like yours, but somebody else's property that you just have a lease on, not. Some say that it's the other way around. Mishlakish turned the tables on Rabbi Yochanan from that very same pasuk. And your wife Malamid Shada maybe Bikuri Ishto B'Koreh. It says even your wife, right? Right there it says Ulaveisecha. There's a special pasuk Ulaveisecha of the Amalo, but normally if it's not your wife's, maybe you don't read. It's not considered a oath. Amalei. The Rabbi Yochanan says no. Time didi daf nami mehocha kamina. That's exactly it. Rabbi Yochanan says, from the fact that Ulav says Ulaveisecha, your wife's produce, you also have to bring Bikurim and Koreh, shows you that Kinyan Paris is Kinyan Guf. Where Shlokish says no. Daf Ulaveisecha, that's an exception. It says your field and your wife's, but if it's somebody else's, not. It's a question how you learn. Esvei. Kasha. He was on the road bringing the Bikurim of his wife. B'Shama Shemay says he heard that his wife died. His wife died. Who inherits a wife in the Torah? The husband. The husband inherits it, right? B'Shama Shemay says he heard his wife died. Maybe B'Koreh. He could bring it and bring. Mesa ain, lo Mesa. Oh, only if she died. Mashma, if she didn't die, he wouldn't be Koreh. That's mash, right? If she didn't die, it's hers. Koreh. So what do you see over here? That it's in his wife's. If his wife she didn't die, you wouldn't be Koreh. Mashma that even though it says L'Beisecha, just the opposite. Not only somebody else, but even his wife's, he wouldn't be Koreh. Why? Because Kinyan Peresh Lafki and Guftami says Gemara, right? So he says Shemay says Yarsha Ukana Gufa Karka. Then he brings otherwise he wouldn't. Who did not forget L'Beisa? Even if he didn't die, also he would be made Kari. Even if she died, I might think if she died, I might think that that if she died, he shouldn't be made Kari because but let's say you gather the fruits and and you sent them with a shliach there, so may shliach and the shliach died, but derech. Maybe then Kore, whoever picks it up from there brings it, but it's not Kore. Why should the one who takes them and the one who brings them in must be one person. If it's a different person, he's not maybe because he brings them, but he's not Kore. So I might think over here also, if his wife died, maybe he shouldn't be Kore because it's similar to he was on the way, and it's similar to that, even though he brought him, his wife died. But it might be gozer like the shliach dies and some of the other things that it's like that, and you should be, and you wouldn't be kari kamashma. You're not worried about that. You don't make that zera. So, but it doesn't make any difference whether it's mesa in mesa low. He's asking a kasha over there like that. Rishon Meishis of Yosha says mashma damra beina lekich v'abal be'echad. Or says Rashi within leboy lekich v'abal be'echad. It's got to bring one person has to do it. That it's not a problem. In other words, his wife, how you baba there for Bikuri Ishta Biyado, and you're because of Adian who Atzma, he himself brought them. Then you go Rashi says Yev Shalom Shebio Shliach Acher, Dafi Lome Shliach Rishon, Ein a Korei. The Tanaisha Betumta Druggers for Shliach Mabian below Koran, Shein Yechon Lamashan Asatali. So we if yourself Shebio. So no, the shliach, and he brought the chiddush is over here that you're not gozer because of the case of a shliach. But the kasha apparently was that even if you see that even if it's bringing his wife's, he's not korei. Even though it says well they second that's not korei. So you see that if you don't own it yourself, if it's kinyan peiros is lafki kinyan guftam because not the answer is that it's not korei. The answer is no. Even whether his wife died or she didn't die, he still is korei. The only reason over here where the wife died, you might think it gozer because of a case where the shliach died. Much more not gozer. Bazut tamayu. The Yochel Shlakesh, who say over here that if you have a kinyan peiros, meaning you bought the land, let's say for 5 or 10 years, you have a lease on the land. Is it considered? Rabbi Yochanan says that the kinyan peiros you have is like kinyan aguf, and you would be making a korban, and Rishlek says not. They go according to their own reasoning. Let's say not you didn't buy, you didn't have a lease, you just sold your field during Yovel. Now during Yovel, it's going to go back. Rebecca says maybe Bikore. The person who bought it, right? The person who bought the field, he brings Bikurim and he reads it because like he owns it, right? Maybe you own the land only temporarily till Yovel. It's only the kinyan peiros. You don't really own the land. So we have the same machlokas when somebody sold a field or bought a field during Yovel, and the same thing when you bought a field not during Yovel, with just a lease for 5 or 10 years or for whatever. Why do you have to have machlokas in both cases? It's obvious. Over there, Rish Lakish says he only bought it for a lease. There, Rish Lakish says the key when you bought the land for 5 or 10 years, a lease, you knew you're only going to get the pay. So you know you don't really own the land. You just have a lease for 5 years. So there, you don't really own it. But when you bought it, the field was an outright sale, except when Yovel is knowing it goes back at Yovel. So when you bought the field, your intention was to own the field. Maybe it's motive of Yovel from there. Kamashwan, no, that he's not motive there. Be it Mebaha. And if you tell me the case of Yovel, there Rabbi Yochanan says that Kinyan Peres because he bought the land. Okay, I have to give it back at Yovel, but I really bought the land with the intention of owning the land. When you only bought it, when you only had a lease for 5 or 10 years, I think it is motive to Rishlakish that Kinyan Peres that they argue in both cases. Tashma Hakona Elon. Let's say you bought a tree, v'kakon, and its land, maybe v'kore. You bring it and you kore, right? So here you see you bought land and what? And a field, maybe v'kore. Even though you bought the land, even if it's going to go back in Yovel, you still have v'kore. So proof to Rav Yochanan that kinyan peres kekinyan aguftami. So maybe it's speaking about when there is no Yovel. When there is no Yovel, that's a different story. When there's no Yovel, but I'm not sure. No, therefore you can't prove it. You can't prove it from there. You bought the field. Where did Rish Lakish say when there's no Yovel that the comparison is lofty? When you bought it only for a lease. when you bought it, you only bought it for 5 or 10 years. But Rish Lakish's moda, that when Yovel is not knowing, like this Manazeh, and you bought the land, when you bought the land, of course, then it's maybe Vikari because it's your land. Let's say you bought two trees in a field. You don't own the field. You only own the trees. Maybe Vikari. If you only bought 2 trees, you bring fruits from the trees, but you don't Vikari because you don't own any land. But if you bought 3 trees, then you get land with it automatically. Maybe Vikari. So here you see that you bring you're chayiv to bring fruits, even though you only own the land till Yovel. It's a proof to Rabbi Yochanan against Rish Lakish. Hachanami is man she'eni Yovel doeg. Again, we're speaking when there's no Yovel. Rish Lakish does not argue. He only argues with the Rabbi Yochanan when there's Yovel, so the land's going to go back, or you'll have the lease for 5 or 10 years. But when there's no Yovel and you bought the land, then he would agree. That's maybe Vikari. The Hashta, Rav Chisra said, the machlokas is only be Yovel Sheni. When Yovel started, the first time things are around, nobody knows how it's going to work. When the first time they had Yovel, they said, Yovel, give it back. Really? Am I going to get it back? So the first Yovel, they weren't so sure we're going to get it back. The machlokas is only be Yovel Sheni when they know it's going to come back. Oh, once the first Yovel passed and they knew that it's going to come back, they were confident of it. So you only have the payers till Yovel. Machlokas is be Yovel Sheni. Yovel Rishon Dibri Akol. Everybody agrees maybe B'Korei. Everybody agrees that maybe Vikari because in the first Yovel, historically, the first Yovel, you were Kari because you really thought you were going to keep it. Like they didn't rely on the fact that they're going to get the field back. So you could say Lokasha from these last 2 cases. Of the Yovel Rishon, Yovel Sheni. You don't have to say that speaking about Bisman Sheni Yovel Noed. You could say that was Bisman in the first Yovel. The first Yovel was Mab Vikari because people didn't really believe they're going to get the land back. The purchasers didn't know they're going to have to give it back, and the owners didn't think they're going to get it back. But the Yovel Sheni, that's different. Those were in Yovel Rishon's maybe Kari. But in the second Yovel, even when there was Yovel, Rish Lakish will answer the Yovel Sheni is maybe B'nei Kari because the land's going to go back. Lema Ketanai, we'll pick up from here tomorrow, Mitzvah Shem, on Monday. Have a good week. Shavua Tov.